With 4 All-NBA players in the top 10, multiple All-Stars in the second round, and a ton of terrible decisions throughout, the 2012 NBA draft has turned into one of the most interesting classes of the 2010s in the 10-plus years since draft night, yet it seems to get forgotten sometimes. You have the amazing 2011 class right before it and the disaster 2013 class right after it, but the 2012 NBA draft has no shortage of crazy storylines to look back on as well. Beginning with, as always, the first overall pick. The, at the time, New Orleans Hornets, soon to be Pelicans, were making this selection, and it was very clear who they were going to take. This was a team less than a year removed from trading away their franchise cornerstone in Chris Paul, and they were clearly in a rebuild, which worked out well for them because one of the best first overall prospects of the decade was right in front of them, Anthony Davis. He was a really interesting story as a prospect though, as when he was in his early years of high school, he really wasn't that well known of a player because he was still the size of a guard. He was 6 foot as a freshman, 6'4" as a sophomore, 6'8" as a junior, and by the time that he became the #1 player in the country and showed up at Kentucky, he was 6'10", but he retained many of the guard skills that he had when he was a much smaller player, resulting in an incredible NBA prospect that was clearly the consensus top guy in this draft. He went into draft night coming off of an incredible college season at Kentucky, player of the year, Final Four most outstanding player, a national champion, but interestingly, he barely led the team in scoring at 14.2 points per game. Granted, that Kentucky team was loaded, and we're going to talk about a lot of the other guys on that team throughout this video, but if you wanted to pick out one flaw from Davis going into the draft, it would be that his path to an elite offensive player was certainly a projection, even though he had all the tools to get there. Defensively, there were zero concerns about him other than him having a skinnier frame, and honestly, there was zero doubt who was going to go first overall here. So New Orleans made the selection, and apart from some occasional injury issues in the beginning, Davis really hit the ground running with his NBA career. He improved a ton offensively after his rookie season, then earned his first All-Star selection in year 2, and by year 3, he was already one of the best bigs in the league, a rare instance of a first overall pick immediately and completely fulfilling their purpose as a prospect. And throughout his 7 seasons with the Pelicans, that would continue to be the case, but for a variety of reasons, mostly poor roster decisions, the team was just never able to surround Davis with enough talent to make a deep postseason run. So of course, Davis did what a lot of players would have done in this situation in a smaller market without a championship ceiling. He forced a trade, and for him, it was to the LA Lakers, where he continued to be incredible, helping the Lakers win the 2020 NBA title. But for me, his time in New Orleans was much more interesting. He was more appreciated there without the LA expectations on him, and even though the front office made plenty of mistakes, they did almost create something special when they brought in DeMarcus Cousins right before Davis requested a trade and Cousins got hurt, and Holiday had some unfortunate circumstances that kept him off the floor as well. But ultimately, as much as people love to trash Davis for a ton of different stuff, when you look back on him strictly as a prospect and compare it to how his career has gone, it is extremely impressive what he turned into. Next up at number 2 is the at the time Charlotte Bobcats, but soon to be the Charlotte Hornets, which makes the top of this draft pretty confusing. They were coming off of, legitimately, one of the worst NBA seasons of all time, with a 7-59 record in the lockout shortened season. It was safe to say that they needed talent anywhere they could get it, especially after losing out on the first overall pick through the lottery. They did have some decent young guards at the time, including Kemba Walker, so the Bobcats selected Anthony Davis's college teammate at Kentucky, Michael Kidd Gilchrist. The 4th-ranked high school player in his class according to ESPN, Gilchrist became a favorite of many front offices around the league during his freshman season at Kentucky. With relentless energy, great defensive instincts, and a good physical profile, he projected as a do-everything forward with scoring upside due to his frame and athleticism. Now in hindsight, that doesn't sound like the most exciting draft pick ever, but this was considered a relatively weak class outside of Davis at 1, and there was just something about Kidd Gilchrist in college that a lot of people gravitated towards. Unfortunately for him and Charlotte, the flaws in his game became very evident at the NBA level. The defensive stuff was all there, and he played hard, but he was just an absolute zero offensively. He couldn't space the floor or create for himself, so he was just a massive negative on that side of the ball. And it clearly began to impact his confidence as the years went by, because he was a guy that in college and as a rookie was like a mid-70s free throw shooter, and suddenly dipped into the 60s and basically became like a 6'8" center that played hard. Not exactly ideal for the 2nd overall pick on a team that had just won 7 games. To his credit, he did stick around in Charlotte as a kind of decent wing for 7 seasons before ending up in Dallas partway through his 8th season, and beyond the 2019-20 season, Kidd Gilchrist has not been seen in the NBA. Moving on now to where things get really weird with this draft, the 3rd pick. At the time, pretty much everything from this point on in the top 10 was up in the air. There was some really talented prospects, but they all had significant flaws while also having a ton of upside, and that was certainly the case with Bradley Beal, who went 3rd here to the Wizards. As a prospect, Beal projected as a high-level shooting guard, specifically specifically as a scorer. Extremely talented and skilled with a ton of upside to become an all-star caliber player. And plenty of people were passionate about the fact that he was the second best player in this class behind only Anthony Davis. The downside was the idea of a ball-dominant shooting guard was starting to lose a bit of its value at the time, and although he was 6'4" with a solid wingspan, he didn't have perfect size for the position and also certainly wasn't a point guard. But the Wizards were extremely excited to add him and put him alongside John Wall in the backcourt, who they drafted first overall in 2010, and create a dynamic duo that, as it turned out, would turn into exactly that. Despite some injury issues as a rookie, Beal showed high-level offensive flashes in year one as Despite some injury issues as a rookie, Beal definitely showed high-level offensive flashes in year one as a 19-year-old, and then showed a ton of year-to-year improvement, improving his scoring average every season for the first 9 years of his career, peaking at over 31 points per game. And for a minute there, it looked like Beal and Wall would lead the Wizards on a deep playoff run, but they just missed their chance a few times. And then Wall's career went sideways due to a ton of injury problems, and Beal ultimately requested a trade in 2023 and ended up in Phoenix. His career is kind of a strange one to look back on because he made an All-NBA team and clearly was very talented, but the lack of team success holds him back, although the Wizards never put a great team around him or Wall, and statistically his time in Washington was extremely impressive. Similar to Davis though, Beal basically became exactly what the top-level version of himself would have looked like in the NBA when he was a prospect, which is really good, even if you can poke flaws in his career as a whole. Moving on now to a selection that, I'm gonna be honest, I hated at the time, Dion Waiters to the Cavs at 4th overall. As I said earlier, this part of the draft was very uncertain, which is how you end up with Waiters, who wasn't even a starter the year before in college, as the 4th overall pick. Now granted, the reason that he didn't start was because 1, the team was really good, and 2, Waiters' role as a 6th man worked really well for them. But it still seems strange to see him go this high. His projection as a prospect was kind of a worse version of Beal, a skilled 2 guard that wasn't quite as tall as you'd want him to be. Waiters was pretty much just a worse version of that, and to start his career in Cleveland, things were pretty weird. Keep in mind that the Cavs, just like the Wizards, had a 1st overall pick point guard on their team. For Cleveland, that was Kyrie Irving, as the Cavs tried to build their team in the non-LeBron James era. Now, to be fair, Waiters was a good player and honestly looked a lot like his college self at certain points in his NBA career, but the fit in Cleveland just did not work out. It's not like Kyrie was a typical point guard, and adding a scoring 2 guard alongside that was just a weird combination. And although obviously there were bigger issues with the team than just Waiters, they really struggled in terms of team success in his first few seasons. And partway through his 3rd, he was traded to OKC as part of a 3-team deal for a few guys that would soon be very important for the Cavs and, more importantly, fit much better on the team: J.R. Smith and Iman Shumpert. Now, of course, by the time Waiters was traded in January 2015, LeBron had returned to the Cavs, so they definitely didn't need the on-ball presence of Waiters, but it was still pretty surprising to see a clearly talented top 5 pick just get dumped for some veteran wings. It worked, of course, as the Cavs won the 2016 title a year and a half after the Waiters trade, but this wasn't the start to his career that he was hoping for. Things just got worse for him in his season and a half in OKC as his efficiency plummeted, and the future of his career was in question at that point. But in the summer of 2016, the Miami Heat stepped up and took a chance on Waiters, and over the next few years, he would have by far his most productive stretch of his career, becoming the microwave scorer that he was always meant to be as a pro. He still had ups and downs, but he earned a new multi-year contract with the team in the 2017 offseason and was a legitimately good and useful player, before falling off a few years later as his career ended. But still, I love that small period of success that Waiters had in Miami, because without it, his career would be viewed as a massive disappointment. But with it, he certainly wasn't a great top 5 pick, but we got to see how talented he was when he was put in the right situation. Moving on now to a pick that I bet a lot of you have forgotten about: Thomas Robinson to the Kings at number 5. Now, the reason you might have forgotten this guy is because these kinds of players just don't get picked in the top 5 of drafts anymore. Robinson was your typical high-energy power forward, guy that rebounded well, was a great athlete, played hard, which we now know projects as a high-level role player at the NBA level, but at the time, teams still loved drafting these kinds of players early on because they really underestimated how skilled forwards would need to be to survive in the new version of the NBA that we were going to see over the next couple of years. Robinson didn't have great size at 6'8", had almost no post or perimeter skills, but still went 5th in front of some very talented players, and you can probably guess that things didn't go super well for him. He played just 51 total games with the Kings in one season before immediately becoming an NBA journeyman, jumping around to a handful of teams and ending his career after just 313 games and 5 seasons. It is, of course, easy to say all this now, and maybe the Kings just thought he'd develop a ton of skills as a pro, but this kind of player, not to mention a guy that was 21 years old as a rookie, would just never be taken in the top 5 in today's NBA. Moving on now to a very tough one for me as a Nets fan: Damian Lillard at 6th overall. In one of the worst trades of all time that nobody really talks about, the Nets basically traded away Damian Damian Lillard for nothing, but more on that later. Lillard as a prospect was divisive to say the least. He was an incredibly accomplished college player, clearly very skilled, and a lot of people loved him and thought he was the best guard in the class, while others were concerned that he wasn't athletic enough, wasn't a true point guard, and played against some bad competition in college at Weber State. To top it all off, he showed up to the NBA as an older prospect as well, and really at the time, you either loved Lillard or thought he'd be a bust. There was no in between, there was no middle ground. You either were a Lillard guy or you weren't. As it turned out, Dame had about as good of a start to his career as you could possibly hope for, immediately establishing himself as a foundational piece to the franchise, and over a long career would go on to become one of the best guards in the league. They didn't have as much team success in Portland as you'd like, minus one run to the conference finals, and then Lillard forced his way out in 2023, but still, he far surpassed every expectation that anyone had for him, which is especially tough for the teams that drafted in front of Portland. Could have had Lillard and ended up with much worse guards like Dion Waiters or guys that played 50 games with the team like Thomas Robinson. Truly, one of the biggest misses in the history of the league by those teams that passed on him. But just to make it even worse, my team traded this pick away. At the 2012 trade deadline, the Brooklyn Nets were trying to build up their team and would soon put together what they viewed as a title contender, but would actually become one of the biggest disasters in the history of the league. But back to the 2012 trade deadline. The Nets, who were at the time a very bad team with a very bad record, traded their 2012 first round pick, top 3 protected, to the Trailblazers for Gerald Wallace, a solid wing who was on the decline and who needed a new contract in the 2012 offseason. So the Nets got Wallace, signed him to a new deal. He did basically nothing for them after that, and in exchange, their pick landed at 6th overall, became Damian Lillard, and thus we have one of the worst trades in the history of the league. Moving on now to another controversial prospect, Harrison Barnes. There was a lot of excitement about him initially when he went to college, as he was the #1 ranked high school player in the country in the class of 2010, even ahead of Kyrie Irving. The problem was he wasn't very impressive as a freshman, so he decided to come back for his sophomore year, and he was better, but a lot of the excitement around him as a potential future all-star had faded by the time the 2012 draft came around. He was still seen as a good prospect, a wing with good size and skill that could develop into a really good player, but the ceiling for him, which once seemed immense, was much lower now. Ultimately, he was still projected to be a top 10 pick and ended up with the Warriors here at number 7. At the time of this draft, the Warriors were still years away from truly reaching their potential and breaking onto the scene in the mid-2010s. They did have some talent in Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, but their futures were still pretty uncertain, and Barnes made a ton of sense for them as worst case a complimentary wing. And as it turned out, Barnes was a solid pro. He never put up crazy numbers or developed into a great offensive player, but he did turn into a good starting wing for years, which isn't terrible value in the top 10 of this draft. He had his ups and downs with the Warriors, helping them win the 2015 title, but also being a huge reason that they lost a 3-1 lead in the 2016 finals simply because he lost all of his confidence in his three-point shot and the Cavs refused to guard him, losing them the title. After that year, the Warriors replaced Barnes with Kevin Durant in free agency, but he found himself a new home with a massive contract in Dallas. He was good there, then got traded to the Kings, and at every stop, Harrison Barnes has been a good, useful wing and a great teammate. Not quite the star that people thought or hoped that he would be out of high school, but still a very good career and a nice pick here at number 7. Moving on now to one of the more high upside players in this entire draft, Terrence Ross. After 2 years in college, Ross emerged as a possible top 10 pick in this draft with some really great potential. He was a good shooter and an outstanding athlete with good size and fluidity as a perimeter player, and there were a ton of people that thought he could end up becoming an amazing NBA player. If he could develop over the years, the sky was the limit for how good he could be. Ultimately, he goes 8 here to the Toronto Raptors, and after a solid rookie year, he then developed into what he would become for the rest of his career. A solid scorer and really good shooter that was a nice offensive piece to have on a team. Whether it was in Toronto or later on in Orlando, he was always somebody that could hit a 3 or get you an occasional bucket, and of course, there was that one time that he had a 50-point game. And even though he never developed beyond that, a role player as good as him is solid value in the top 10 here. As we get to the end of the top 10 here at number 9, you might be wondering who the 4th All-NBA guy is that I mentioned in the intro. Well, that player is Andre Drummond, who goes to the Pistons here at 9. Drummond was an extremely raw prospect, a crazy good athlete with great body control for his size and an outstanding rebounder. He needed to develop a ton of skill, but he definitely had potential. His prospect evaluation might sound weirdly like Thomas Robinson's from earlier, but the difference here was Drummond was younger, a better athlete, and had more potential to develop some of the skills that both of these guys lacked as prospects. And once Drummond's career really got going, he became one of the more underappreciated bigs in the entire league. He never became a great 20-point point per game offensive player or anything, but he could take over games with his rebounding and energy on the offensive glass, and for years was a great center for the Pistons. He never became a great defender, and his free throw shooting was always an issue, but to develop into an All-NBA caliber player, given how raw he was as a prospect, is still really impressive. Moving on now to yet another really impressive former high school prospect, Austin Rivers. He entered this draft after an impressive freshman season at Duke, and a year before that, he was one of the highest ranked players in a high school class of 2011. The son of Doc Rivers, Austin was an electric scorer, although he was limited in terms of size and athleticism, which is what caused him to drop to 10 here. For him to become a big-time NBA player, he'd have to be one of the most skilled guards in the entire league, and that just never happened for him. He ended up in New Orleans alongside Anthony Davis, as this pick was one that at the time the Hornets ended up with when they traded Chris Paul to the Clippers the year before. And honestly, Rivers' career got off to a really concerning start with horrendous efficiency that made him look like a complete bust early on. After just 2.5 seasons, he was moved to the Clippers and played for his dad, and at that point, he did start to turn his career around as a spark plug offensive weapon, eventually developing into a nice guard for the Clippers. It didn't last for too long though before he fell back down to just being a role player, jumping around to a handful of teams, and was last seen in the NBA in 2023, a somewhat disappointing career for a player that many had high hopes for early on. Moving on now to number 12, Jeremy Lamb, who was about to be involved in one of the biggest trades in NBA history, but more on that in a second. Lamb was, in many people's eyes, the biggest steal in the draft here at 12. He was a very skilled two-guard with good shooting ability and athleticism, and had a lot of success in college at UConn, with some people even comparing him to someone like Reggie Miller or Rip Hamilton, and most people were surprised to see him drop this far in the draft. The Rockets took him here, but he didn't last long on the team, as just a few months later, he was sent to OKC in a package for James Harden. The Thunder, fresh off making the 2012 finals, made the inexplicable decision to move on from Harden for a variety of reasons, and the Rockets got their franchise player for years in the process. For Lamb, OKC seemed like a solid place for him to develop alongside Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook, but that just didn't happen. He played just 23 games as a rookie, and even though there were some flashes, he never did much to capitalize on his draft hype in OKC, which was a big deal for them because they saw him as a significant piece in the Harden trade. Lamb ended up moving on to Charlotte, where he found his place in the league. It became a nice complementary scoring option, peaking at over 15 points per game in the 2018-19 season, and even though most of those Charlotte teams were pretty bad, it was nice to see Lamb carving out a place for himself in the NBA. After a few years, he ended up in Indiana and then Sacramento to finish out his NBA career, last seen in the league in 2022, ending a career that did include some injury issues, but still for most people was pretty disappointing considering Lamb's talent, with less than 600 games played total. Next up at 13 is a prospect that I remember a lot of people liking, Kendall Marshall. He was a very rare true point guard in college, winning a ton of games as the kind of assist-oriented lead guard that had begun to go out of style in the NBA by 2012. He was a really good passer, but unfortunately didn't bring much else to the table in the NBA and was going to be really limited by his lack of athleticism. The Suns, meanwhile, who held the 13th pick here, were trying to find their way in the post-Steve Nash era and didn't have a ton of talent, so a setup guard of the future seemed like a decent idea. The problem was, Marshall just wasn't a good NBA player. He played just 48 games total in one season in Phoenix before ending up with the Lakers, Bucks, and Sixers, and after just 160 games across 4 seasons, his career was over. He bounced around in Summer League and the G League a bit, but certainly ends up as one of the worst lottery picks in this draft. And the next up is actually Marshall's college teammate at UNC, John Henson. He had a really interesting career because he was a highly touted high school player, but was seen as this kind of like athletic wing with great size, but as his college career went on, he became more of a traditional power forward type with great athleticism. And after 3 years at UNC, entered the draft as an intriguing defensive big with some offensive upside. And honestly, Henson was good. The Bucks picked him here at 14, and although he had some issues with injuries at times, he was a productive 20-minute-a-game guy that really had an impact defensively. He never developed beyond that, but still, he was a useful player. Moving on now to number 15, Mo Harkless. As a top 50 high school recruit going into college with legit NBA wing size, he was a pretty big riser during his freshman season at St. John's, putting up over 15 points per game and causing NBA teams to wonder if he might be a steal in the first round as he continued to develop offensively. The Sixers took him here, but just a few months later in August, he was moved to the Magic in the Andrew Bynum, Dwight Howard, Andre Iguodala mega deal in 2012, and at the time, I was excited about what Harkless might become at the NBA level. Unfortunately for him, he never developed into a go-to scorer on the wing, but he still had a really good career. He was fine for 3 years with the Magic before moving on to his best spot, the Trailblazers. They were always in need of 3-and-D wings during this era, and Harkless began to thrive there in that role, peaking at nearly 30 minutes per game and 10 points per game in the 2016-17 season. He never found much success outside of the Blazers after moving on from the team in the 2018-19 season, but still he was a good player, played over 600 NBA games, and at this point in the draft, a lot of times you'll take that. Moving on now to a guy that honestly I put on the list because I thought he was going to be awesome in the NBA, Terrence Jones. He was a great high school player that ended up playing in college at Kentucky, and after a good freshman season, pretty surprisingly decided to stay for another year. And although his stats went down, that team won the national title because of the insane talent of him and of course the other top 2 picks in this draft among other guys. Jones was a talented, bruising lefty forward with perimeter skill, pretty similar to like a Julius Randle type player, but maybe a bit less athletic. He entered the draft as a guy that nobody could really figure out. He was clearly talented, but if he didn't develop into a star or something close to it, his archetype was going to be pretty hard to turn into a role player at the NBA level. The Rockets ended up picking him here, and for a brief time, I thought he'd have a great NBA career. He didn't play a ton as a rookie, but in year 2, he played 76 games, over 27 minutes per game, and over 12 points per game, and was efficient, looking every bit like a guy on the path towards a good career. But then it just kind of stopped. He struggled with some injury issues over the next few years and just didn't really develop before ending up on the Pelicans, then the Bucks, then playing professionally overseas and in the G League. As of this recording, he is still continuing his career internationally, but unfortunately for him, despite a promising start, his NBA career just never took off. Moving on now to one of the more productive players in this first round, Evan Fournier. A shooting guard out of France with good size, he projected as a good shooter and scorer that might struggle athletically at the NBA level. The Nuggets took him 20th here, and he's had a long and productive career as a much better scorer than most thought that he would be. He has been helped by ending up on some bad offensive teams that needed him to score, most notably the 7 seasons that he spent with the Magic, but it's hard to argue with his statistical production over the years. Next up is a super interesting player, Jared Sullinger. He showed up at Ohio State and immediately established himself as one of the best front court scorers in college basketball. A bruising post big, he was kind of a slightly worse version of what Jahlil Okafor was in college, and after his freshman season, he likely would have been a top 10 or maybe even top 5 pick in the 2011 draft had he entered. Instead, he returned for his sophomore season and had another good year, but didn't necessarily show NBA scouts anything new. So he slipped a bit to 21, where the Celtics took him. He projected as, at best, an Al Jefferson kind of player, an old school post-up big that could take advantage of certain matchups, probably best used off the bench unless he developed into one of the best post bigs in the league. After a rough rookie season, Sullinger broke out a bit in years 2 and 3, averaging over 27 minutes per game and 13 points per game for some weird Celtics teams. But it didn't last long, as his numbers declined in year 4. He ended up in Toronto in year 5, and after just 11 games there, ended up playing the rest of his career overseas. Sullinger was a good offensive player, but a complete liability defensively, and the kind of big that just didn't really work in the modern NBA anymore. Speaking of guys that could have gone much higher in the draft, at 28 is Perry Jones. He had an unbelievable physical profile as an athlete. 6'10", great body control, had some perimeter skills, looked like he had crazy high upside at the NBA level. After his freshman season at Baylor, there were rumors that he might be a contender for the first overall pick in the 2011 draft, but he actually decided to stay for another season, and just like Sullinger, didn't show much improvement and slipped to the late first round. Essentially, this pick was all about development. As a player, physically, Jones had it all, and if he improved his jumper and became a better perimeter player, he would be an all-star. If not, he'd be a bust. As it turned out, after the Thunder picked him 28th here, Jones played just 143 NBA games across 3 seasons, peaking at just over 4 points per game in his 3rd year, before continuing his career in the G League and internationally, and as of this recording, he is still playing professionally overseas. As we move into the second round, I do want to mention an underappreciated player, Jay Crowder. He was a high-energy physical wing in college that didn't look like he had the skill to be a good NBA player. He probably was going to be able to guard, but that's about it. The Mavericks actually ended up with this pick, but where Crowder really developed was in Boston. He was sent to the Celtics in the Rajon Rondo trade, and there he became a nice 3-and-D wing for them and a handful of other teams throughout his career by developing into a solid shooter with good size on the wing. Not exactly the most exciting guy, but worth mentioning in the second round. Next up though, in terms of value and where they were selected, is the best pick in the entire draft, Draymond Green at 35th overall. We all know the story with Draymond now, with his on-court antics and all that stuff, but his story from college to the Warriors championship teams is really interesting. He was a top 40 recruit heading into his freshman season at Michigan State, a 6'6" forward with defensive instincts and vision, but a limited scoring skill set, a really unique player. He wasn't impactful as a freshman, but got better year after year in 4 seasons in college and became a real force for them as a senior, improving his offensive game and bringing an energy to the floor that was hard to ignore. Ultimately, he had a weird projection at the NBA level though, because he was only like 6'7", clearly a front court player, and wasn't a great offensive player, but there was just something about him that teams liked. The Warriors took him at 35, but even they obviously had some questions about him because they held the 30th pick in this draft as well, and they passed on Green for Festus Ezeli. But regardless, Draymond's career in the NBA has been amazing. He didn't get a ton of minutes at first, but in his third year, the 2014-15 season, everything changed. The normal starting power forward, David Lee, was dealing with injuries, and the Warriors had a new head coach in Steve Kerr. And Draymond took full advantage of his new starting role. He didn't shoot the ball well, but he defended, rebounded well, gave great effort, and was an intriguing passer as well as a great connector around Steph and Clay. Of course, they won the title in 2015 and a few more after that as well, with Draymond always at the center of it all. The true heart and soul of the team, even ushering in a new wave of small ball units around the league, which seemed inconceivable for someone his size. But what people missed was Draymond had great defensive instincts and a super long wingspan, which is really what made the small ball stuff work. Obviously, there have been plenty of issues along the way, but there is no arguing that this is an incredibly impactful pick by the Warriors in this draft. But Draymond is far from the only huge value in the second round, as at 39th overall, we have Chris Middleton. He was originally picked by the Pistons, but didn't do much in one season there, and then was sent to the Bucks as a throw-in in the weird Brandon Jennings-Brandon Knight swap in the 2013 offseason. And in Milwaukee, against all odds, Middleton has developed into an all-star. A, yes, limited athlete, but great shooter, skilled offensive player, good size, and is a solid two-way player. This is one of the more out-of-nowhere all-star developments of this decade, as Middleton was just like a solid 3-year college player and then didn't do a ton as a rookie, but his development not only has been great to see, but also is a big reason the Bucks won the title in 2021. Oh, and also Will Barton is good and was picked at 40 here by the Blazers to finish out the notable second round guys. And that is what happened to the 2012 NBA draft.